Collins is now a convicted felon and no longer a member of Congress.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Empire State Weekly. I'm Tim Lake in Albany. In a stunning turn of events, Western New York State Congressman Chris Collins resigning from office and pleading guilty to 2 federal charges against him.
Former New York Congressman Christopher Collins pled guilty to insider trading and to lying to the FBI in order to cover up his insider trading scheme.
Now, the high-profile Republican got insider information from a company on whose board he sat that their stock was about to drop after a failed clinical drug trial. Collins then passed it along to his son, who tipped his future father-in-law, both selling their shares and avoiding nearly $800,000 in losses.
Collins admitted to, among other things, illegally tipping his son while standing on the White House lawn.
Yes, now Collins is now facing prison when he's sentenced on January 17th. His son, Cameron, and Cameron's fiance's father, Stephen Zarsky, also pleading guilty to conspiracy to commit securities fraud. And covering this story for Empire State Weekly is our Buffalo reporter, Chris Hervadas from News 4 in Buffalo. Chris, thank you very much for being with us here on Empire State Weekly.
Collins is now a convicted felon and no longer a member of Congress.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Empire State Weekly. I'm Tim Lake in Albany. In a stunning turn of events, Western New York State Congressman Chris Collins resigning from office and pleading guilty to 2 federal charges against him.
Former New York Congressman Christopher Collins pled guilty to insider trading and to lying to the FBI in order to cover up his insider trading scheme.
Now, the high-profile Republican got insider information from a company on whose board he sat that their stock was about to drop after a failed clinical drug trial. Collins then passed it along to his son, who tipped his future father-in-law, both selling their shares and avoiding nearly $800,000 in losses.
Collins admitted to, among other things, illegally tipping his son while standing on the White House lawn.
Yes, now Collins is now facing prison when he's sentenced on January 17th. His son, Cameron, and Cameron's fiance's father, Stephen Zarsky, also pleading guilty to conspiracy to commit securities fraud. And covering this story for Empire State Weekly is our Buffalo reporter, Chris Hervadas from News 4 in Buffalo. Chris, thank you very much for being with us here on Empire State Weekly.
You're welcome, Tim. Thanks for having me.
All right, certainly. So Chris Collins pleaded guilty to 2 of these charges that were against him. Now, the theory is that it's obviously some part of a plea deal for a reduced punishment in the end when he is sentenced. So give us an idea, what kind of a prison time is he facing, and would he possibly get less time than the time that he's facing?
Well, the max sentence, Tim, is 5 years in federal prison on each of the 2 charges he did plead guilty to, but it's not very likely that he'll end up serving that full max sentence. In the federal system, there's something called sentencing guidelines, which is basically a formula. You basically input data which includes any criminal history, of which there's really nothing to speak of for Congressman Collins. You take a look at the charge they pled guilty to. You compute this, and it, in the case of Chris Collins, comes out to about 4 years in prison. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to serve 4 years in prison. The judge doesn't have to sentence him within those guidelines, if there are mitigating factors or aggregating factors, the judge can go up or down on that. So we won't find out until January, but that's the number that people are looking at, about 4 years in jail or so.
So we don't know all the inside deal making that has been going on in this, but the assumption is that Collins made this deal, we would think, to maybe spare his son a longer prison term. Explain to us now the circumstances surrounding Cameron Collins' guilty plea and that of his future father-in-law as well. And is there a chance that the younger Collins could even avoid prison time? Do we know?
Well, Cam Collins and Stephen Zarsky, his future father-in-law, only pleaded guilty to one charge, whereas Chris Collins pleaded guilty to 2 charges. So they are looking at a little bit less time, a max sentence of just 5 years on that, just one charge. And sentencing guidelines for them call for them to spend a little more than 3, a little less than 4 years in prison. Not very likely that they avoid prison time altogether because it's not common for judges to go outside of those guidelines. But again, they can if they want to. There is plenty of speculation that the congressman, I should say former congressman now, did make this decision to protect his son, but not very likely that his son avoids prison time altogether in this case.
So now we shift to that open seat in the 27th district, and that is all the counties to the south of and kind of surrounding Rochester and Buffalo. So what happens now? How do those seats get filled? Because we have some time left now before the election that would have filled the seat if Collins was able to run for re-election.
Well, a special election would have to be called by Governor Andrew Cuomo, and he has made the point that in his view of the law, he cannot call one in November when we already have an election day scheduled. So he made the point on WBFO radio earlier this week that he is looking at possibly calling one in April, the same day that we have presidential primaries. But consider this district, the 27th Congressional District, it's a lot of rural area and some second-ring Buffalo suburbs. It's an overwhelming Republican advantage there in terms of enrollment. So if there is a special election in April, the fact that there is a Democratic presidential primary then might balance out that Republican advantage in enrollment a little bit.
Yeah, we certainly don't know what the governor would do, but of course the governor is a Democrat. He could have a Democratic appointment to that seat. As you said, it's been Republican for a long time. I realize you've been covering the trial and the court hearings there in New York. Has there been any indication of any kind of involvement from Washington which would be very interested in keeping this a Republican seat in the future?
Well, something interesting to keep in mind, Chris Collins was one of President Trump's biggest allies on Capitol Hill. Chris Collins was the first congressperson to endorse Donald Trump when he ran for president. So Chris Collins no longer being in Washington is not something that is going to really please the president. They were allies. They worked together on a few things. So you can be certain that the president would love to have that seat filled with somebody that he feels he can work with. And while it is true that it is an overwhelmingly Republican district, the person who held that seat prior to Chris Collins was a Democrat, the current Lieutenant Governor of New York, Kathy Hochul. So it's not unheard of for a Democrat to hold that seat. And I'm sure Republicans are very aware that they can't just take for granted that this seat will be theirs. They're going to have to campaign for it whenever the time comes, whether it be a special election or next November when that seat will be up for grabs.
All right, Chris, let me ask you about this. The Iraq War veteran and Buffalo radio host and Medal of Honor winner, David Bellavia, might want to run for that seat. He would certainly be a shoo-in. A lot of people would like to draft him as a Republican to run for that seat. What has he been saying about that?
Well, he's certainly considering it. He is a radio show host on WBEN radio in Buffalo, as you mentioned, Tim, and he said on WBEN a few days ago that he's going to make a quick decision. So he is thinking about it, we know. And I'll go back to, again, you would think President Trump would love to have an ally back in that seat. Well, he was standing on a stage with David Bellavia in June, putting the Medal of Honor around his neck. So you would think that they could forge certainly some sort of a professional partnership. an alliance, David Bellavia in the president, if David Bellavia were to be in that seat. I was in Washington when David Bellavia got that Medal of Honor. I spoke to him and sort of asked about his political future, if he had one, if he had any aspirations for one. And he said his first priority would be the Army, helping out with recruitment. Second would be his family. And then third would be any political aspirations he might have. Keep in mind, he did run for this seat in 2012, and Chris Collins defeated him in a primary. So he has a history of running. Will he have a future of running? Again, he said he will make a quick decision. We'll have to wait and see.
Well, I think a lot of people are guessing, and a lot of people are guessing that he will. You, of course, will be one of the first to know, since he has said if he will, he'll make the announcement there in Buffalo. Chris Horvatis from News 4 in Buffalo, thank you again for being with us here on Empire State Weekly. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Tim.
Coming up, new regulations for stretch limousines, and if New York State doesn't toughen the laws, then the federal government will. It is the one-year mark since the tragic limo crash in eastern New York that killed 20 people. And if you have a comment or a story idea, let us know about it. You can email Empire State Weekly, and you can find us on Facebook and Twitter.
Vehicles that served as a death trap should not be allowed on the road.
Action is needed to address these safety failures.
Welcome back, everyone, to Empire State Weekly. I'm Tim Lake in Albany. Federal lawmakers here in New York State are now demanding action on limousine safety regulations. And this comes after the NTSB offers new limo seatbelt recommendations following the crash here in upstate New York that killed 20 people a year ago this weekend. Bipartisan congressional legislation now outlining a 4-point limousine safety action plan that includes the Safe Limos Act.
These bills will slam these loopholes shut, get unsafe vehicles off our streets, and set federal stretch limo safety standards that will help save lives and get limos off the road that never should have been there in the first place.
Now, the legislation would impose safety standards for converting used vehicles into limousines and on seatbelts and seating arrangements inside the limos. The NTSB's report on safety recommendations says the passenger area of the upstate limousine that crashed was survivable space, suggesting that seatbelts and proper seats could have made a difference for some of the passengers who were not buckled in. Diane and I are now taking just a few minutes to review some of the recommendations and the federal legislation that is planned as well. And this is interesting, Diane, because the National Transportation Safety Board aimed its safety recommendations at 3 entities, and one of those is the New York State Department of Transportation. Now, the DOT immediately responded to this by saying essentially that we already do these kinds of inspections on the limousines. And another interesting part was they said that Governor Cuomo, for the past 3 years, has proposed stricter seatbelt regulations for both passenger cars and limos and these types of things for the past 3 years, and the legislature has turned it down. So DOT, in essence, is turning things back toward the state legislature.
And saying somebody needs to act. So, of course, there was such a huge crawl and outcry for people to act last year. It's been now 1 year, and not a lot got done. There were so many different proposals out there last year in reaction to this, maybe because it's such a complicated case, and maybe because there were just so many things that went wrong, and in retrospect, people looked at and said, why hasn't this happened? So a lot of things were proposed and not a lot of action. I do feel pretty confident that this year, though, the state will probably pass quite a bit of legislation involving limousine regulations and seat belts and so many of these aspects. I think we'll finally get the signature.
And it's likely that won't happen until the legislature goes back in session. I know that news organizations here in eastern New York, all over the state for that matter, have asked the state and the governor's office if there might be a special session for the limousine bills. And I don't think there's any chance of that, so I think that'll come up in the first of the year. Now, the other recommendation was about the combination of lap belts and shoulder belts, and the fact that in some of these limousines, the NTSB found that they literally put the lap belts down below the seats where they aren't seen. And the recommendation said, if a passenger gets in and sees that there's no seatbelt or it's not available or you can't see it, they're apt not to use it.
Right.
And in their report, they said this space inside the limo was survivable, and that some of the passengers might have been able to survive if there were seatbelts. So therefore, they're focusing on the seatbelt issue.
The seatbelt's a big issue, and making it, of course, a lap as opposed to just across, or making it a shoulder as opposed to just across the lap, that right there makes something much safer when it comes to seatbelt use. And yes, you need to be able to see they're there. Yes, they need to be functional. And also there was a lot of big concern about the way the seats themselves were attached and the positioning of seats when it comes to these retrofitted and altered vehicles, that there's so much more that could be done to make this a safer experience for people who are going out and celebrating, trying to do the right thing. So a lot of changes, I think, are going to come to the seatbelts.
So there's the state impact here. We also have the federal government and members of Congress who met with some of the families of the victims of this crash just this past week. And the federal regulations are going a step further as well. And I think the most important takeaway from there is that when you stretch one of these limousines out to hold more than 15 passengers, so far, it does not fall under the commercial vehicle guidelines, which are much more strict and also include a commercial license to drive one. So that's the first thing they want to do, and I would see the chances of that passing on the federal level is quite good.
Right, so I think we're going to see action both on the federal and the state level. So many things to do with the altering of the vehicles and then classifying so that they are then under the same kind of regulations. Some of the people would say, look, a lot of this has to do with things that were already on the books as far as inspections. We could have already been doing these, it just should have happened. But it seems that they need to get a lot tougher on a lot of these laws. I do want to take a minute and talk a little bit about the families because they've had an excruciating year. They have, I think, gotten together, spent a lot of time together. I think they're working very much as one when it comes to the lawsuits, not completely in lockstep, but they are working together. But this week, when we saw the unveiling of the Safe Limo Act, the federal regulations that they're looking at and the requests that they're making at that level, we did see the families start to come out and talk a little bit more. They said they wanted to help, or they wanted to thank the people in their community. They also really wanted to thank the first responders.
Right.
And maybe we'll be able to see them this year. A few of them already have been getting involved in going to our state leaders and said,
I think we'll see more of that.
We need this. I think we're going to see even more. I don't think there's any way that these things cannot be passed in this legislative session.
As we speak, in fact, they are dedicating the memorial at the site of the crash. And then as this legislation moves forward, I think we're going to see more of a lobbying effort on behalf of the families and their representatives. And of course, the legal case is going on as well. But I think once the state legislature reconvenes, and of course, as Congress pushes these bills through Congress, I think you're going to see key members of the family step up and take part in lobbying for this, if not for the very least as a memorial to the
they found themselves in such a position to have had this loss, and now they have to be spokespeople for these issues, things that they weren't ever thinking a year ago that they would have to be, and then they're also involved in all these various lawsuits. As far as the operator of the limo company, their trial now has been pushed back to March, which again,
so it's going to take a while.
Push back a little further.
All right, well, it's certainly a sensitive issue, and I know we feel for everybody who has to go through this. Another big issue here on Empire State Weekly, the flavor ban on vaping in New York State. This time, a key court decision is a temporary win for the vaping industry. And of course, if you have a comment or a story idea, let us know about it. You can email Empire State Weekly, and you can find us on Facebook and Twitter. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly, everyone. I'm Tim Lake in Albany. A New York judge has now temporarily delayed the state's ban on flavored vaping products. The state appeals court judge sided with Vapor Technology Association, asking for a temporary restraining order against the state over its ban on flavored e-cigarette products. Now, the ruling gives the court time to consider the association's lawsuit that we told you about last week here on Empire State Weekly. The ruling also came a day before the state planned to start enforcing a 90-day emergency ban on flavored vaping products. Now, Health Commissioner Dr. Howard Zucker says that, quote, while the court's ruling temporarily delays our scheduled enforcement of this ban, it will not deter us from using every tool at our disposal to address this crisis. We're confident that once the court hears our arguments, they will agree. Now, as you know, we've been discussing this very important issue here on Empire State Weekly the past couple of weeks. Diane, we've had people from the vaping industry on, vape shop owners, health officials discussing this from the get-go. So I'm curious, what's the takeaway here? The Supreme Court, of course, turned down the temporary restraining order. The appeals court now says it's time for a review. Do you see this as a case where maybe this was moving too fast and the courts are saying, let's slow down maybe and take a look at this?
In some ways, it just seems like a typical way things go through the courts. It's not unusual for the courts, I think, to say, let's just slow down for a couple of weeks. And this just really delays the ban. It's still expected to happen, but delays it for a couple of weeks unless something happens that says, no, you can't go forward. So it's really just a slowdown. The question is the urgency. You've got over 1,100 people sick nationwide. You've got well over a dozen people who have died. And so it seems a very urgent matter, but the vaping industry has a somewhat valid argument in saying, look, these are thought to, and it's not completely determined what's happening here, but it's thought to have occurred with illegal products.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the governor is saying it's also urgent because we're getting in these new numbers about how many teens are starting to take up and become addicted to nicotine. So that seems fairly urgent as well. This is really just, I think, a pause in what's going to continue to be a huge dialogue, and I think that we're probably also going to see something happen on the national level with this.
Yes. And here in Albany, of course, we're going to be watching to see just how this plays out, because we're curious to see if this is a legislative issue or if the governor does have the authority for this emergency order. And there's where the politics come into play here on this important issue.
The big question is, could he put in a temporary ban, and then could the legislature put in a more permanent ban? Would that be something that would happen? But again, if this is an approved product, this is a very complicated thing, but I think we're going to see some action on the federal level.
Either way, I know I've been reading articles from around the state, and I know that vape shop owners are still clearing out their merchandise. They see this more as, we've got to get rid of this. We know we're going to go out of business if this is put into effect. We've got to make a move now.
Very sudden and difficult for them.
I do need to add, though, that the state and national health recommendations still are not to vape until they find out what's causing both the deaths and these serious lung illnesses. So the choice is yours, but those are the recommendations. Well, now, homeowners, if you live along Lake Ontario and you had damage from the high water flooding, you may be able to get state aid for your repairs. We'll explain coming up. Finally, here on Empire State Weekly, people whose homes were damaged during record flooding along the shores of Lake Ontario this year can now apply for up to $50,000 for repairs. Now, affected homeowners have until the end of this month to request the state funding for damage at primary homes only and damage that isn't already covered by homeowners insurance. It cannot be for a vacation home. The state says up to $20 million is available through the recovery program. Applications are available on the New York State Homes and Community Renewal website. And of course, separate aid has also been available for businesses. For now, though, for all of us here on Empire State Weekly, I'm Tim Lake in Albany. We'll see you right back here next week. And don't forget, you can watch Empire State Weekly all over New York State. Here now is the full schedule of Empire State Weekly on 10 television stations across New York.